Picture this. One medieval queen was so disgusting, her dress had to be cut off, because after 8 months of refusing to shower, the dress fused to her skin. The so-called Holy Queen of Spain walked around wrapped in her own decay of sweat, rot, and blood. But she wasn't even the worst. You weren't supposed to see queens like this. And no queen revealed it more brutally than Isabella of Castile, the most powerful woman in 15th century Spain, champion of the Reconquista, wife of Ferdinand, and founder of the Spanish Inquisition. She spent the final year of the Granada campaign refusing to wash. She vowed not to bathe or change her clothes until the city fell, and it took 8 months. By the time the gates opened, her undergarments had fused to her flesh. Chroniclers claim the fabric had to be cut off, peeled away like a second skin, soaked with bodily rot. And this wasn't seen as a breakdown. It was praised. Her rot was divine. Isabella wore her decay like a relic. The filthier she became, the more devout she appeared. In her mind, and in the eyes of her confessors, she was not a queen declining. She was a saint in the making. Her conquest of Granada wasn't just military, it was spiritual. The body was a battlefield, and hers was crucified for Christ. The stink was part of the sacrifice. But Isabella wasn't alone. Zoom out, and you'll find this same pattern repeating across the centuries. Queens who made themselves vessels of sacred decay. Take Margaret of Hungary. Born a princess in 1242, she was handed to a Dominican convent before puberty. She never washed her face, wore hair shirts that shredded her skin, and welcomed lice as blessings, letting them crawl across her body even during prayer. When they bit, she smiled. "Each bite," she said, "is a kiss from God." Dirt wasn't a burden. It was theology, a holy garment. And Margaret wasn't a wild eccentric. She was canonized as a saint. Centuries later, school children were taught to imitate her humility. And then there's Elizabeth of Hungary, another royal saint. Daughter of a king, wife of a landgrave. She gave everything to the poor, including her own body. During penance, she slept in her own excrement, curled up in filthy straw beside the dying. She would scrub the sores of lepers with her bare hands, then kneel to kiss the wounds. Not because she was ignorant of disease, but because she believed those wounds were Christ's flesh. The decay wasn't hidden. It was worshipped. Picture it. A palace stinking of sour wine and sickness. Candles flickering over a barefoot woman with scabs on her arms and feces on her hem, and behind her, a priest, watching with reverence. This was godliness. Queens were expected to shine in jewels, but the holiest among them stank of death. That's the inversion you were never taught. In the medieval mind, beauty was pride. Cleanliness was vanity. Soap tempted the soul, not just the skin. So the dirtier a queen became, the closer she was to heaven. Even court chroniclers wrote with awe about unwashed hair, scabbed hands, lice crawling across a sainted brow. And they wrote it seriously. You're starting to see it now, aren't you? This wasn't just uncleanliness. This was spiritual theatre. Queens turning their flesh into icons, their decay into scripture, and the public believed it. Because if their queens could crawl through filth for salvation, maybe their own misery meant something too. But here's where the story starts to twist. If sacred queens wore rot like holiness, what happens when filth becomes fashion instead of faith? When the decay is no longer spiritual, but sensual? Because that's where we're going next, into a world where lice were luxury and black teeth were beauty marks. But before we continue, hit the subscribe button and like the video, because we have a lot more disgusting secrets to unpack. Filth evolved, from proving holiness to proving power, and no royal woman embodied that twisted transformation more than Elizabeth I of England. By the late 1500s, she was the sun around which English court life orbited, majestic, untouchable, eternal. But her mouth told a different story. You weren't supposed to see the rot behind her rouge. Elizabeth's teeth blackened over time from her obsession with sugared delicacies, candied violets, syrup-soaked oranges. Sugar was alchemy, status, imported wealth in edible form. Her breath reeked. Her smile was a graveyard. One ambassador reported that she spoke with difficulty, and court gossip whispered about her gums bleeding. But here's the grotesque part. Her courtiers began painting their own teeth black. They weren't sick. They were imitating the Queen, because if Elizabeth's mouth rotted, then rot itself must be regal. We like to think we're cleaner now, more evolved. But the instinct hasn't changed. We still follow power into illusion. If the crown wears rot, we paint our smiles to match, maybe not with lice or black teeth, but with beauty trends that hurt to maintain. The mirror still lies, when royalty speaks first. Now, filth didn't fall from power. It was absorbed into it. Just ask Isabeau of Bavaria, Queen of France, consort to a mad king, jewel of a decaying court. A physician found over 1,000 lice just behind her ears. They shaved her bald. The stench was so overwhelming that even the court physicians gagged. But the Queen never flinched. She'd been raised on velvet and incense, but she walked into lice with the indifference of a butcher. And maybe that's the point. Cleanliness was for the insecure. Queens didn't flinch. Queens endured, even when their own bodies turned against them. And some, like Queen Christina of Sweden, embraced that decay with open arms. During one formal reception, Queen Christina stood up, removed her wig, and lice spilled down her neck like a living necklace. A courtier looked horrified. She only smiled. "My most loyal subjects," she said. "They never abandon me. That's not just defiance, that's performance." Christina dressed like a man, refused to marry, and treated etiquette like a personal insult. The lice weren't just pests, they were props. A mocking rejection of the fragile, powdered femininity royal courts tried to cage her inside. She turned infestation into identity. But don't laugh too quickly, because her rot had more integrity than the powdered perfections around her. You weren't supposed to notice. The portraits showed white teeth, perfect hair, perfumed air. But behind the rouge was the reek. Behind the silks, the scratching. Imagine a court so obsessed with elegance they mimicked disease. Picture noble women with powdered hair teeming with nits, men bowing to queens, while lice burrowed behind their eyes. That wasn't just disgusting, it was tragic. These queens weren't pretending to be holy anymore, they were pretending not to rot, and failing. That's where it starts to turn, doesn't it? Some embraced filth, others were destroyed by it. The rot got under the skin. Queens began bleeding for their crowns, literally. In one German court in 1456, a winter banquet was interrupted by a smell so foul the windows had to be thrown open. It wasn't the food, it was the women. Every noblewoman in the hall was menstruating. Their linen rags, washed in stale urine and reused for weeks, had soaked through their skirts. The servants whispered. The Duke turned pale. But no one said aloud what everyone already smelled. These weren't peasants. These were princesses, and they stank. Picture it, lace and velvet, chandeliers glittering, while the walls sweat with rot. You're not supposed to imagine that part. History paints these women in silk, not sweat. But what they wore underneath was soaked in ammonia and blood, and the horror doesn't end there, because when a queen bled too little, or too much, men took it as an omen. Something was wrong with the womb. And that meant something was wrong with the state. Catherine of Aragon married Henry VIII at 16 and spent 2 decades trying to give him a son. Every miscarriage, every stillbirth, not fate, but failure. Catherine's physicians forced her to squat over steaming piles of goat dung, believing the smoke would awaken her womb. Can you imagine the smell of that? Hot dung rising into an open cervix while a priest mutters psalms and a midwife crosses herself. But this wasn't fringe, it was policy. Galenic medicine met religious desperation, and queens became human furnaces. Catherine bore it all with quiet resolve, but the damage was physical and spiritual. Burned, blistered, and humiliated, she still couldn't deliver the fantasy England demanded, so they cast her aside. That's the part the portraits skip. They show her in crimson velvet, not crouched in dung smoke. But even when a queen delivered, like Jane Seymour, Henry VIII's beloved third wife, she died anyway. 11 days after giving birth to Edward VI, Jane spiked a fever. Puerperal fever, they called it, a polite name for filth. Her doctors had just come from a dissection table. They didn't wash their hands, they brought death with them. Think about that. The most powerful woman in England, dying of bacteria they didn't yet believe in. Her womb had done its job, but the rot was already in the room. And here's where the silence becomes deliberate, because these deaths weren't anomalies, they were expected. Royal childbirth was a public performance behind sealed doors. When things went wrong, no one was punished. The Queen was blamed. Not the smoke, not the knives, not the blood-soaked hands of a physician holding yesterday's cadaver. You're starting to see it, aren't you? They called it medicine, but it was ritual sacrifice. A queen's blood was never her own. It belonged to the dynasty, the state, the future. And when she failed to bleed the right way, they let her rot quietly. But we're not done yet, because even after death, their bodies weren't safe. The worms were just getting started. Now, imagine sitting at a royal banquet. Silver plates gleam, harps play in the distance. The Duchess to your left raises her goblet, and a maggot drops onto her meat. She doesn't scream nor flinch. She brushes it off and keeps eating. Welcome to the vermin court, where lice were loyal subjects, wigs were compost heaps, and worms had a better seat at the table than most nobles. The records call this refinement, but you and I know what it really was. A kingdom infested, in life, in death, in memory. The Queen led the way. Remember Queen Christina of Sweden? She once removed her wig mid-ceremony. Lice cascaded down her body like confetti. By the end of her reign, she called them her faithful companions. Maybe defiance, maybe delusion, but the lice were real and thriving. Because here's what they don't teach you in royal histories. These women were buried in filth that outlasted them. Decay became their afterlife. Take a French duchess in the 1700s. Her wig, styled with scented oils and animal fat, became a breeding ground for flies. So, as she dined in candlelight, larvae hatched between her curls, and by dessert, they were falling on her plate. Nobody said a word, because aristocracy had trained them to ignore decay. Can you imagine that? Rot so normal that it doesn't even interrupt the meal. The nobility weren't blind to filth. They had simply made it part of the etiquette. The closer you sat to the crown, the more you were expected to ignore the crawling truth. The worst came after death. Centuries after Queen Isabella of Aragon was buried in a silk gown, archaeologists opened her tomb, and there they found it, a queen's dress still intact, and inside it, the shells of lice eggs, dormant, preserved, waiting. Not myth, not metaphor, real, documented vermin clinging to a corpse in silk. They buried her in glory, and she decomposed in company. And here's the darker truth. Lice weren't just tolerated. They were normalized, ritualized, even spiritualized. The parasites became symbols of loyalty, like Christina's wig, of extravagance, like powdered wigs, of martyrdom, like Isabella's skin-fused gown. Even in rot, the monarchy found metaphor, because when a queen decays, it's not just a body breaking down. It's a system rotting from the scalp down. You weren't supposed to hear that part, but that's the truth they buried with the crown. The filth wasn't just physical, it was philosophical, a kind of sacred decay passed from queen to queen like an heirloom. The lice didn't leave, not in death, not in memory. Queens were bathed in oils, embalmed with herbs, sealed in marble, but rot still found them. Maggots made crowns their cradles. Lice laid eggs beside sacred relics. The filth stayed faithful. They called it divine grace. They called it beauty. They called it power. And maybe we haven't left it behind. We still crown perfection, perfume decay, filter flaws, and praise endurance while ignoring the wounds beneath. The rot didn't vanish, it just changed costumes, but you've seen it now. What they really ruled over was decay, so when they polished those portraits and powdered those corpses, it wasn't to hide the filth, it was to worship it. If you want more secrets they buried beneath perfume and gold, hit the subscribe button, because this was just one stench they tried to burn from the record.